I had overheard their conversation yesterday. My mother-in-law was talking about my brother-in-law and his wife coming back home for the birth of their child. The moment I heard her say, "You should start moving your stuff out to the yard," my heart sank. I knew what was coming next. "Excuse me?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You heard me," she said, not even bothering to look at me. "You can't have kids anyway, and you don't help with Eric's work. The least you could do is make some room. They'll need space for the baby." "But I pay $20,000 a month in rent," I reminded her, my voice growing more strained with each word. "This is getting too tiring," she snapped back, waving her hand dismissively. "Just deal with it." Living with my mother-in-law had always been challenging, but this was the final straw. My husband, Eric, my brother-in-law, his wife, and my mother-in-law. This house was full of problems, and I had tried to keep things running smoothly for too long. I was done. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll leave, but I can't just throw my belongings out into the yard. I'll come back later to pick them up." My mother-in-law didn't even look at me as she said, "Thank you, that's a big help." She had already moved on, her attention focused on something else, someone else. I went upstairs, packed my things, and left the house. 7 seconds after stepping out the door, I took out my phone and called a junk removal service. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just acting. Once I made up my mind, there was no stopping me. My name is Rachel, and I'm a 43-year-old IT consultant. My husband, Eric, is also 43 and runs 4 restaurants. We're both 43, and people often assume we've been married a long time and have a kid or two. But the truth is, we're newlyweds. We both lived as workaholics and didn't marry until later in life. I had given up on marriage just before turning 43, but a chance visit to a bar after work changed my mind. "Is this your first time here?" he asked. "Yes, that's right," I replied, feeling a bit out of place. "I've been curious about it for a while, but it's hard for me to go in alone since the place is so stylish. But I worked hard today, so I decided to treat myself." I was relieved to find a counter where it was easy for a loner like me to spend time. Eric, the bartender, chatted with me as I sat at the end of the bar. He was just trying to attract a new customer, but for someone like me, who had no friends to eat with at this age, even this kind of service felt nice. Feeling comfortable in Eric's restaurant, I started visiting often. I always sat at the end of the bar, and it became normal for Eric to chat with me while I ate. Over time, we got to know each other better. "What does an IT consultant do?" he asked one day. "I introduce IT solutions to companies and do strategic planning," I explained. "I've worked with restaurants too. I once suggested a tablet-based ordering system to reduce labor costs and improve efficiency." Eric was curious and always eager to learn. He looked for ways to apply new knowledge to his work, and even though it seemed like just a pleasant conversation, I was slowly drawn to his dedication. Likewise, Eric grew fond of me, seeing that I was hardworking. "I'm always busy with work and can't talk much," he said one evening. "But how about we go out for dinner sometime?" Excited about the chance to dine with a restaurateur, I eagerly agreed. We started dating, and 3 years later, as we both turned 43, we decided to get married. Feeling shy about being a bride at 43, I asked Eric to skip the wedding ceremony. We just took some photos of us dressed up and left it at that. After we got married, I moved from my apartment to Eric's house. It was a 4-story building with a garden and parking located in a high-end area. The rent was around $22,000 a month, a price I thought was absurd for just 2 people. But Eric explained, "I have a brother, Steven, who's 4 years older than me. He left home after college, and we've mostly lost touch. He hasn't been home at all, and it's been a few years since I've heard from him. He's been moving from job to job and place to place. He's the kind of man who might get into trouble and come back to us. So, we decided to rent a bigger house. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just happy to have a nice place to live. But soon after moving in, I regretted accepting Eric's suggestion to live with his mother so quickly. "Why do we need such a big house just for you and your mother?" I asked one day as I unboxed my books. Eric smiled and replied, "I guess it all worked out now that I'm married and you've moved in." His casual response didn't ease my concerns. And as I settled into my new home, I began to understand the real reason for the extra space. My mother-in-law didn't like me. "You can't have kids anyway," she would say, her words dripping with disdain. What's the point of you being here?" I tried to ignore her, to focus on my work and my marriage, but it was hard. My mother-in-law's coldness towards me became more apparent with each passing day. She ignored me when I spoke and tried to avoid me whenever possible. It was lonely, but I convinced myself that I could build a relationship with her over time. But then things took a turn for the worse. "Are you okay with your work?" I asked Eric one evening. "No, it's pretty bad," he admitted, his head in his hands. "I need to take action soon, but it's tough to arrange the finances." The situation at Eric's restaurants had worsened. One of the 4 stores had already closed, and it seemed another might have to shut down too. Seeing Eric's troubled face made me feel distressed, but my mother-in-law seemed unaffected by these troubles. "You're Eric's wife, but you don't help out at the store," she hurled insults at me from her seat on the sofa. "Can you really say you're fulfilling your role as a wife?" I wondered what she was thinking, but I knew she had her own perspective. Eric had been running his own restaurant for nearly 12 years, overcoming various challenges. I believed he would pull through this time too. "You, his wife, shouldn't be making that face," she shouted again from the living room to the dining room. "Are you trying to feed into his anxiety and make him fail? What a terrible wife!" Her words were filled with spite, but I took them positively. I decided to support Eric to the fullest, smiling reassuringly at my anxious husband. A year later, just as she had predicted, Eric managed to turn the situation around and avoided closing the second store. But things weren't as rosy as they seemed. Eric, having stabilized the business and with a bit more money, seemed to get carried away. I started hearing rumors about his affair. What is he thinking? I thought to myself. If there's extra money, there are surely better ways to spend it. Eric's business revenue had dropped before, and now it seemed the same was happening in our marriage. "Eric, Stephen called. His girlfriend is pregnant," my mother-in-law announced one day. "That's great news." Her excitement was palpable, but my heart sank. I knew what was coming next. "They want to move into this house," she continued, "and they're asking if they can work at your restaurant." I looked at Eric, who was clearly troubled by the request. He had always been close to his brother, and now, with a baby on the way, it seemed impossible to say no. "Come on," my mother-in-law urged. "It's a good thing. Stephen is in trouble, and you, Eric, have the means to help him." Okay, I got it," Eric sighed, unable to stand up to his mother. I had hoped he would stand up for me, for us, but it seemed that was just wishful thinking. The worsening relationship with my mother-in-law, Eric's affair, and now living with Stephen and his family, the problems just kept piling up. I was overwhelmed and didn't know where to start. So I decided to abandon everything for the night and just go to sleep. The next day was a holiday, and probably due to extreme mental fatigue, I slept in until late morning. When I finally got up, I was dreading what my mother-in-law might say about my sleeping in. But what she said was far worse than I had expected. "You heard Eric and me talking yesterday, right?" she began. "Stephen and his wife are coming back for the birth of their child, so move your stuff out to the yard." "Excuse me?" I asked, still groggy from sleep. "You can't have kids anyway," she continued, her voice cold. "And you don't help with Eric's work, so you should at least make room for Stephen and his family. We have 2 spare rooms left, so if you leave and your office is free, we can have a bedroom and a nursery for them. Don't you think the room count and usage are just perfect?" It was clear she was telling me to leave. I was being kicked out to make room for something that didn't even seem necessary. I thought about the $20,000 I was paying in rent and how tired I was of dealing with all of this. I decided to clear my mind and rest, letting the ticking of the clock fill the silence in the living room. After resting, I made up my mind. It was too much trouble to worry about what happened to Eric, my mother-in-law, Stephen's family, and their future. I chose to leave the house. "Understood," I said calmly. "I'll leave. I can't put all my belongings in the yard, so I'll come back later to pick them up." "You're leaving?" "Thank you. That helps," my mother-in-law said, pleased. Ignoring her, I started packing my things and left the house. 7 seconds after stepping out the door, I took out my phone and called a junk removal service. My decision, made after stopping my overthinking, couldn't be stopped by anyone. Let them all regret this choice later. 3 weeks after leaving, I rented an apartment and started living alone. I hadn't heard from Eric since then, and he probably thought I would come back eventually. The thought of Eric taking the situation lightly infuriated me. But today, I knew Eric would call. It was the day after his restaurant's day off, and he would notice something was wrong when he visited for lunch prep. "Hey, what's going on here?" Eric's voice was frantic over the phone. "The restaurant is completely empty." Just as I thought, Eric called. "I could explain over the phone," I said, "but it would be more efficient if your mom was there too. I'm heading to the house now. Can you come back? You can't open the restaurant anyway, right?" I couldn't help but laugh before hanging up, amused by Eric's reaction. He must have been quite shocked. Still chuckling, I started getting ready to leave. When I arrived at the house, my mother-in-law started yelling at me. "What on earth is this? The restaurant's fridge, cooking equipment, tables, all the important stuff is gone. You did this, didn't you? Do you think you can get away with this?" It seemed Eric had explained half of the situation. There was an unfamiliar couple in the living room, apparently Stephen and his wife. They looked confused and anxious, not fully grasping the situation or my mother-in-law's extreme anger. "Why would you do such a thing? The restaurant can't operate now," my mother-in-law screamed. "It's my restaurant, so there shouldn't be a problem with me starting the closing process or having the items I bought disposed of by a junk removal service, right?" I replied. "Huh? Your restaurant? What are you talking about?" my mother-in-law asked, her face red with confusion. "Why don't you explain, Eric?" I suggested. "You haven't told your mom, have you?" Eric looked uncomfortable, but knew he couldn't avoid the truth any longer. "You remember that I still have the main restaurant and the second branch, right? And the second one was in a financial crisis," he began. My mother-in-law nodded, still confused. "Well, about that, Rachel actually paid for those expenses," Eric confessed. "What? What do you mean?" she asked, bewildered. I decided to explain everything. Before turning 43, I was single and working in IT consulting. We didn't have a wedding ceremony, nor did we buy a new house after getting married, so I had saved up quite a bit of money. I lent Eric $400,000 to help turn around his struggling second restaurant branch. $400,000? "But you can't just hand over such a large amount of money to your spouse, right?" she protested. "That's why I decided to buy the rights to the second branch and become its owner," I explained. "I left most of the management to Eric, so there wasn't much for me to do as the owner. The only change was that Eric shifted his focus from the main branch to the second one for its recovery." My mother-in-law looked at Eric, still struggling to understand. "Eric, is this true?" "Yeah, it's true," he admitted. She said it was okay if I failed and wasted the $400,000, but since it was such a large amount, she suggested becoming the owner. The plan was to pay back the borrowed $400,000 from the restaurant's earnings, but it was simpler for Rachel to become the owner and have the restaurant's income go directly to her. It also meant that she could decide whether to close the restaurant or not. "It's a lie. Can something like that really happen?" my mother-in-law exclaimed. I understand it's hard to believe, hearing all this suddenly. "That's why I brought some evidence," I said, spreading documents like the business license, transfer of rights agreement, and lease agreement on the table. My mother-in-law's face turned even redder as she confirmed my name on those documents. "Why didn't you say anything about this?" she demanded. "You always talked about how you believed in Eric and how the restaurant was recovering, right?" I continued. "Even before we got married, you always encouraged Eric like that. He felt pressured by your words but tried to live up to your expectations, not wanting to disappoint you as the head of the household." My mother-in-law looked down, guilt and confusion washing over her face. "That's why Eric couldn't tell you he borrowed a large sum of money from me," I added, "and that's why I couldn't tell you either." Eric looked at me, regret etched on his face. "Rachel, I'm sorry. This situation is my fault for not being decisive enough. If I had managed the restaurant well from the start, you wouldn't have had to lend me money. And if I wasn't so weak, I could have told you the truth." My mother-in-law finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for everything. I won't tell you to leave again." But I wasn't satisfied. The discussion was far from over. I reached into my bag and pulled out a set of papers. "What's this?" Eric asked, picking up the documents. "Divorce papers," I said calmly. Eric's face turned pale. "What does this mean? Why a divorce? This is supposed to be a reconciliation, right?" "Don't just assume we've reconciled," I replied coldly. "You might think it's a secret, but I know about your affair with the part-timer. All the part-time workers knew about it too." "That's just a rumor. You can't say things like that without proof," he protested. I displayed an image on my smartphone, one that a part-time worker had sent me, and placed it on the table amidst the scattered documents. "This is a photo of you entering a hotel. It was taken by one of the part-timers. If you leave the restaurant together and walk toward the nearby hotel district, anyone can take such evidence." Eric's face drained of color as he realized he had no way out. "As the owner of the restaurant, I couldn't do much in the day-to-day operations," I continued, "but I still visited from time to time. That's when the part-time workers told me about your affair and asked for my help. When I promised to handle it, they provided incredible support. They sent me proof, and even kept the closure of the restaurant a secret from you." "Wait a minute. Closing the second branch and a divorce? What's going to happen to the rent for this place?" Eric asked, his voice shaking. "The rent for this place? What do you mean?" my mother-in-law asked, now even more confused. "I haven't mentioned that yet," I said. "I've been paying the entire rent of $20,000 a month for this house." "Is that also true?" she asked Eric, her voice barely audible. "It's true," he admitted. "When the restaurant's revenue started falling, Rachel started paying half of it. But as revenue continued to drop, the amount she had to cover increased. Eventually, she ended up paying it all. So if Eric gets divorced and only has the main restaurant left, obviously living here won't be an option anymore," I concluded. Eric and my mother-in-law seemed deflated after hearing my words, slumping as if they had exhausted themselves in a boxing match. Stephen and his wife, now somewhat understanding the situation, hesitantly joined the conversation. "What does that mean? We came back here and can't live here?" Stephen asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Wait, Stephen, this is different from what we heard," his wife said, panic creeping into her voice. "We thought everything would be fine once we got back home." "Sorry, Stephen, but right now I don't have the means to help you with a restaurant or a house," Eric replied, his voice weak. "Come on, do something. We're having a baby," Stephen shouted. "We have enough part-timers. In fact, we need to cut down on staff costs. Eric will work hard, so just wait a bit longer," I interjected. "That's what I'm talking about," Stephen shouted, his frustration boiling over. "Hey, what about my house and job now?" Eric, my mother-in-law, and Stephen started arguing about their future lives. Stephen's wife, whose name I still didn't know, looked uncomfortably out of place. I had delivered the news about the restaurant's closure and the divorce, so my business here was done. I was tired of constantly trying to smooth things over with Eric and his family, and I refused to live with Stephen and his wife. I didn't care what happened to this house next. They could discuss it amongst themselves. I left the house amidst their shouting. After that, having evidence of the affair, I was able to divorce Eric smoothly. I could have demanded alimony for the affair, but I had a job and didn't need the money. I wanted as little to do with my ex-husband and his family as possible, so I didn't ask for any compensation. After our divorce, Eric couldn't afford the rent and had to leave the house with his whole family. Financially and emotionally strained, Eric, who had been taking care of his mother, argued that it was actually Stephen's responsibility as the eldest son. But Stephen, who came back without any money, couldn't take care of her. This led to an ugly fight between the brothers about who should take care of their mother. In the end, with no income, Eric had to take her in. But this fight ruined the relationship between the brothers. As a result, Stephen and his wife disappeared again, cutting off all contact. Witnessing the brothers' dispute over her, the mother-child relationship also deteriorated. Now, Eric and his mother are living together reluctantly in a smaller apartment. It's not as spacious as the previous house, and they have to see each other all the time, but they hardly talk, creating an awkward atmosphere in the house. My actions, prompted by thinking ahead, resulted in the breakdown of a family relationship. After the divorce, I first dealt with closing down the restaurant. It was a bit of a hassle, but as the owner, it was my responsibility. However, the fridge, cooking equipment, tables, and chairs I had removed were fairly new, so I managed to sell them at a good price. Adding just a little more money allowed me to finish the restaurant's closure. Though it was a brief period, being a restaurant owner and handling its closure was an experience I believe will be useful in my IT consulting work someday. I guess work suits me better than marriage, and convinced of this, I continue to work hard today.